Hello, podcast listeners. You are now listening to the Coffee, Health, and Science podcast. I'm your host, Jordan River, and I want to thank you for tuning in today. Before we get started, please share the show with a friend. We always appreciate when you guys share the Coffee, Health, and Science podcast. It helps us grow. We have resident coffee cultivation and just coffee expert in general. Ildi Revi is on the line. How you doing, Ildi?
Hello.
So good to have you back.
How are
Thank
you?
I'm doing great. I'm doing so fantastic. I appreciate you taking the time, as always, to talk more about roasting today. So excited to get into roasting. Ildi, where did we leave off? We talked about a lot of great constituents in coffee. We talked about first crack. We talked about melanoidins and different acids. I want to talk about what this all adds up to here. The roast curve is such a hot topic in the pardon the pun, in the coffee industry. But that's kind of what you end up with here when we're talking about roasting temperature versus length. Why don't we start there? Talk to me about roast curves and what all this stuff that we've talked about already adds up to.
Okay, roast curves. So when we talk about a roast curve, what we're talking about is the graph of time versus temperature. And how we talked about, I think before, how fast how much heat and what temperature you put the coffee into the roaster, what temperature you take it out of. All of those things are plotted on a graph, and it flows, so it creates
Forms a little
curve.
shape. Yeah, forms a little line.
Exactly. And so we can go through that.
Yeah, I would love to
let's
just hear how you guys at Purity have landed on yours, obviously, but then just also roasting for health versus flavor and what that shape looks like. I don't know if it's just an even curve or if there's different stages. Yeah, enlighten us.
Well, there is. So if you're thinking about a curve, imagine a piece of graph paper, and on the vertical y-axis, you have temperature. And on the x-axis, going left to right, you have time. Mm-hmm. So we start the roast at 0. And most roasters, and when I talk about roasters, there's so many different types of roasting systems. I could digress here into, types of roasters, whether it's an air roaster, whether it's a gas roaster. And if it's a gas roaster, is it a natural gas or a propane roaster? Drum design, some roasters with gas rotating drums. Some are recirculating roasters where they heat up the air and for environmental and just energy purposes, they'll recirculate the heat. So
this all plays a part in the curve.
All of this stuff, it all plays a part in the curve. And I think we talked last time about how I could tell you the curve that we use at Purity, but our roaster is going to be different than almost every other roaster out there, meaning our roasting machine. So even if you had the same curve, if you put it in a different roaster and roast it, like if you hit all of the benchmarks at the same time, it would still taste different.
Come out different. That's wild.
Same coffee. Yeah, it is. And we've actually done tests like that. We did a test like that back in March with a group of about 40 roasters. And, we do this, and it's happened at the Roasters Guild too, where you taste the drum.
The Roasters Guild. That's awesome that there's a Roasters Guild, first of all.
Coffee Roasters
But
Guild.
Yeah, it's so many small factors.
Let's talk about the curve. So we'll talk about in general. So again, this is just general. Mm-hmm. So we'll put let's say the coffee is green coffee. It's unroasted. It's a raw agricultural product. And so you put the roast in usually around 375 to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Mm-hmm. And as soon as and of course the green coffee is room temperature. So the curve starts out, if you could imagine plotting this, at just say 400. Which some are a little too hot, because as soon as you drop the coffee in, if it's in a drum roaster, it's gonna hit the sides of the drum, and you don't burn the outside of the beans, and at the onset. So some roasters will put in the coffee at a little lower temperature, like 375. Some put it in even at 350. The problem is, as you go lower, you really need to have enough momentum of heat to get those beans where they want to be, or you're going to spend, you're going to use a lot of the heat to be making chemical changes that you may not want to make, or just having this slow roast that if we roast for too low a temperature for too long of a time, the coffee tastes baked. It tastes bready or like biscuits or something
Oh,
instead of
interesting.
like coffee. Yeah. So you have to have enough momentum of heat going into it. But what a specialty coffee roaster who's totally going for flavor is going for, they will really, really play with and mark points in the roast between, probably about 340 degrees and first crack, that's where they really play around with the flavors of the
Interesting.
coffee, and they'll keep it. So a lot of roasters have computers systems attached to their roasting machine, so we can watch the roast happen on a basically an Excel spreadsheet type looking thing, and we can watch the temperature,
Sounds
and we
like
can
heaven for
see
you
the
coffee
curve.
nerds.
Well, it is heaven, but it's also for coffee nerds as well as quality control people, because once we've determined the curve, so the flavor people will do that, but we'll also do the same thing for health. And when we first started Purity, we had a roaster take out the coffee at several, we started with a different coffee from Brazil, which we no longer use. So we have a whole different green coffee. We have a blend of coffees. And so what we will do is we'll take it out at certain temperatures, send it to the lab, like 10 packets of coffee at one at, everywhere starting from 340 degrees up until, 440
Hmm.
degrees to see what is in there, what's gained, what's lost. And scientists
Jeez.
do these experiments. A lot of the literature is there. So it does take a lot. So once we determine what we want to see happening, and this was back in 2016. So as we got new coffees in, we did something similar, but the coffee kind of behaves in a similar way.
Sure, that makes
Um,
sense. It probably varies
yeah,
slightly from cultivar to cultivar on levels, but the chemical processes
exactly.
probably are probably remain the same. Is there anyone else out there doing this? I mean, who? It's really cool that Purity does this, because who else has an interest in like funding this type of thing? Like, are you guys kind of breaking some ground when it comes to your research in your work with like Vanderbilt and these people?
Yeah, it's actually we Vanderbilt informed us, but we actually work with
Down in Brazil,
uh,
down in Rio, right?
yeah,
Sorry,
a
yeah, I got
group
that
of
wrong.
scientists in Brazil. It's a whole lab in Brazil. It's their Department of They have a Department of Nutrition that's just focused on coffee.
Whoa,
It's amazing, and it's a scientist with I think she has 12 grad students, and each one is working on a project. So we get to participate with
that's so cool.
them.
I'm sure
Like yeah,
so many people are grateful for this research and work you're doing. Is what I'm saying.
it's interesting because she has one graduate student just focused on coffee and prostate cancer issues, and
Whoa.
one researcher just working on coffee and breast cancer
So
research.
all these different
Just like
facets in a
that's it.
vacuum.
I mean, yeah. And so then we've had others look at roast, chlorogenic acids and so. So yeah. So we look at the curves, and then we send our coffee down there. And once we get back the results, we use a computerized system called Cropster. It's very common in most roasters, around the world use that. There's also a thing called Artisan, and there's actually a free program by a friend of mine named Neil Wilson, who's one of the best roasters I know. It's called Typica. So anybody listening who is interested in roasting and doesn't want to buy these expensive systems,
Nice.
Typica is out there. Yeah, he's so cool. He's like amazing.
That's really cool. This is all being driven by like app technology.
Yeah, well, so we can follow the curve, and once we've nailed the curve, then we have our roaster in North Carolina has Cropster. So I can literally be watching our coffee as it's
That's so
roasted
cool.
every day from my office, because I don't stand behind the roaster roasting the coffee.
Right.
But they follow the curve, and so this sort of thing happens, where the curve can change because coffee gets older over, once a coffee, look, you get fresh crop in coffee, really, I mean, practically speaking, green coffee can be used for 2 years and it's totally fine. It's going to it'll be fine. But it's just like any product, fresh is best. I mean, you could eat a can of beans that's a year and a half old. It's food safe, but it's just it's lost its chi.
Yeah, totally. It's chi, exactly. That's great.
But
Yeah.
the coffee is similar, and when it first arrives from the farm, it's going to taste different than 6 months later. And it's not like, please, whatever you listeners think, do not take away that there's something wrong with the coffee after 6 months. It's totally fine for like years,
Right.
like a couple years. But
there is
but
some
after
diminishing.
6 months, it does. Yeah, something changes, just like anything,
That's
changes over time.
Such a complex
and
little bean.
And so as it changes, the curve, so even though we have started with a curve, when the new coffee arrives,
you have to adjust.
We're going to have to adjust it. Exactly.
I'm so excited to see how this develops and how the science ends up panning out. It's incredible. I wanted to jump back though, if I could, really quickly and interject. You mentioned something about slow roasting coffee not turning out well. I thought that was interesting because, most of the time, like when you're dealing with meat, for instance, a lot of the time slower is better. But when you're saying slow roasting coffee produces this kind of like baked, cookie taste or bread taste, I thought that was really interesting. So you can't just go slow and low and expect to have some superior product. You really have to fire them up.
Yeah, you want the product to be drinkable. Also,
it's just so interesting.
Yeah, I think over time, so we haven't actually done this sort of test, like do a hour-long roast, at a very slow. I don't even know if it would first crack. We call it baking a coffee. When you bake a coffee, the first crack can be really lazy, sort of pop, pop, pop.
Interesting.
and now I shall pop again.
But I guess I'm surprised at how fast roasting coffee is if you're saying 8 or 9 minutes.
Well, this is another thing, Jordan, it's similar. Imagine baking cookies. First of all, you want to make sure when you imagine baking a tray of cookies and you put different sizes of dough down on the pan.
Right.
Like, let's say you used a tablespoon for one cookie and 2 for the next, and tablespoon. So all the cookies are, the
different,
amounts of dough you're not careful. And you put it in the oven at the same temperature. What's going to happen?
Right. It's going to all be uneven.
Exactly. Some are going to be burnt, while some are going to be sort of undercooked, and some are going to be perfect. It's the same with the grading of the coffee. So this is one of the first things about specialty. People think specialty is just flavor, but there's also a grain standard for specialty. And there should not be a 5% variance in the bean size with specialty
5% variance?
Right? Yeah. So,
Wow.
So with but there can be magnificent specialty coffee, like tasting coffees outside of that variance. You get a lot from Ethiopia that are picked, and you get tiny beans along with big beans. You throw it in the roaster and it comes out and you taste it. And it's like, that is awesome. And had you graded out and made them the same bean size,
it wouldn't have the same complexity.
Like,
that is so fascinating.
Yeah, exactly. So, so a roaster has choices. Do you roast the different bean sizes the same?
Right.
Do if you have 3 different coffees, like you have like a Nicaragua, Guatemala, and a Honduras or something. Do you separate them out and roast them each individually and then blend them, which after we call that post roast blending? Or do you throw them all in together, even though they may not be the same size, and see what happens?
That is
Now,
fascinating.
see that each thing is going to produce different flavors. Sometimes you're limited by your equipment. So if you're roasting 1,000 pounds of coffee and you're doing that, 3 different size blends, you're going to need some huge cement mixer to
Right.
blend it. So, which a lot of roasters don't have. So these are some of the choices. So first of all, you have the different bean sizes, putting them in at different temperatures. But when we're going back to time, you asked about slow and fast roast. A slow roasted coffee will be very evenly cooked through. And we have color meters. We call them, they're based on usually something called an agtron is like the, it's
Agtron.
like the Kleenex, it's like the Kleenex or Xerox of, we call it agtron.
Right.
There's a machine called agtron, but there's other color meters, different manufacturers. And you put in the coffee whole bean into the color, and it'll give you a reading. And then you grind that same coffee, put it back in, it'll give you another reading. So
Interesting.
if you have fast roasted the coffee, very often the outside of the coffee may give you an agtron reading of like a medium-ish roast is like 60 agtron. So you're going to get like 60 on outside. But if you grind the coffee and stick it in there,
Less done on the
and
inside.
higher the number, the lighter it is, you may get an 85 agtron if you've roasted it super fast.
I see. So it's kind of like throwing a steak on a high temperature
20-point
grill.
difference. Exactly.
Yeah, the
So the
outside is
inside
burnt, but
is
the inside's
raw.
raw, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And that produces that, people do all sorts of crazy things in roasting to get flavors that they want.
Right.
How healthy is that? These are the questions that we have to ask.
That's so fascinating.
So because, and this is why I've seen, comments by people who look at this coffee and health and think it's nonsense, but there really is actually science behind it, and there is science to roasting different coffees. So not every roaster, the only way a roaster can know health-wise what they're doing with their coffee is to send it to a lab and test it.
Totally.
And see what
Analytics and
chlorogenic acids and trigonylene and, acrylamide is produced, or PAHs, which are produced at very high temperatures. Some of these very dark roasted coffees really are not good for you.
Let me ask you about the harmful compounds in coffee. I was just speaking with someone, and we were talking about mycotoxins in coffee, pesticides in coffee, and things like that. And they said, well, how is that affected by the roasting? So I wanted to ask you, when it comes to contaminated coffee or coffee that's been grown with pesticides, how does the roasting affect those negative compounds we don't want?
Okay, so this is another big topic, probably for another podcast, but let me just say in general a few things. We test our green coffee for yeast, mold, pesticides, mycotoxins, and then we test for metals, and we test for a couple of enterotoxins like Bacillus cereus. Right. So that's the green coffee. Now, that's the raw agricultural product. When we're talking food safety, which is part of health, right? Yeast and mold is one of the sort of funny things, because when we test for yeast and mold, it's just a general yeast and general mold. And remember, coffee is fermented. Like their fermentation happens. It's not a fermented food, meaning it's not sitting in acetic acid.
Mm-hmm.
But during the processing, you're picking this fruit, to get to the seed part, there is some activity that has to happen, and fermentation, like technical fermentation, is part of it, even if it's dry processed or if it actually is washed coffee, which enters fermentation tanks. So you're going to have yeast and bacteria involved in the process, like yogurt bacteria and yeast. People eat yeast and yeast supplements. So not all are bad, and that's really important. But I test. So the test that we do for mold and yeast is a general test, and I test for it in green coffee because I want to know the levels that would be possible if for some reason there's some kind of cross contamination. Now at our roastery, we have a very serious firewall between green coffee and the roasting area, and we make and everything, because the roasting step is, we're talking 400 degrees Fahrenheit. It's what's known as a kill step in food safety.
Whoa.
So roasting is a kill step.
Right.
And so once the coffee's roasted, it's sanitized coming out. A lot of pesticides are also burned off in roasting, which is why you can test commercial coffee is not organic and there might be no pesticide residue on it. But that's just the sort of outside. But some of it, a lot of pesticides burn off in roasting. I don't know which ones do. There's so many hundreds of chemicals out there.
There's a lot of them, and some are much more
everyone.
Stable than others. I know for a fact when it comes to certain
Exactly.
things. All their properties are wildly different when it comes to their ability for runoff, their ability to withstand heat, their ability to degrade over time or remain over time. It's really yeah. So, and I know we're trying to get rid of some of the more nasty ones, but I guess what you're saying is it varies on that front.
It varies on that front. A lot of chemicals are burned off. Some are retained. I don't know which is which. I don't even know if any scientist is studying that at this point. I mean, science is so far behind some of what people want out of their food, and some of these tests, I don't even know how they would come up with them.
Right.
But definitely mold and yeast is killed during the roasting step. General mold and general yeast. This is the next thing is a very important point, though, Jordan.
I'm following. I'm on the edge of my seat. Mycotoxins and ochratoxins. These are different than mold and yeast. Is it a byproduct?
Exactly, and people conflate them all the time.
Right.
So they are they're what are called metabolites. So the ochratoxin, the mold is a living thing. As it sort of, just imagine mold. This is how I imagine it, and I'm sure scientists will roll their eyes at this. But a mold attaches itself to the food product, right? And it starts to break it down. It starts to eat it, basically. The mold, like juices and saliva that it's breaking down. These are the things that become the mycotoxins.
I see.
It's not the actual fuzzy mold itself. It's the mold eating the food product.
The process. It's the tools in which it's
the mold saliva or whatever it is.
I got you.
I'm
right there with you.
Metabolite. Or the glue that makes it stick to the.
And this can remain even after 400 degrees of.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely. And that is the problem with mycotoxins, is they're still in roasted, especially at the lighter roast stages. They found there is some drop off of ochratoxin at super dark roast, but then now we're at those dark roasts where you don't want.
You got other undesirables like pH. Yeah.
Exactly. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Which
that makes sense.
Yeah. So all of these things are impacted by the roasting.
That's really pertinent though when it comes to the ochratoxin and the mycotoxins and their ability to survive that. I wonder, because there was a big controversy over like Bulletproof Coffee and their claims about how prevalent mold is in coffee, and then Joe Rogan got involved and he did a test and he said that's bullcrap. But I was skeptical of that test for this exact reason. I don't know exactly what they were testing for. I don't know what time of year. Ildi, wouldn't it matter what time of year they were testing, depending on the climates?
Yeah, let's clarify this and let's get this straight here. Mold and yeast. So when they're talking about when no mold in coffee. Most coffee on shelves has had this kill step. And if it's a sanitary plant with good manufacturing practices, they should get it out of the roaster into a sanitary container, into a sanitary packing area where everything gets it put into clean, sanitary, fresh bags
Right.
and sealed with nitrogen and packed before any kind of mold can happen. That's how most coffee is in the
Right.
world in terms of mold. Now, wait a second, hold your horses. I'm talking sanitary people with good manufacturing practices. When we tested coffees, roasted coffees that I ordered a whole bunch off of Amazon. I went to the Whole Foods. I went to my local supermarket. We did over 150 coffees and we send them to the lab, yeast and mold results. Some had actual, and we're just talking yeast mold general, some had mold in them,
Wow.
which shocked me because I was of that, it's a kill step. This is all garbage, this stuff. How did the mold get in there? Well, there's two issues that I have come to learn. The first is not everybody runs a clean shop.
Yes.
So if they're using the same scoop that they use for green, the roaster is, scratching his head and touching the green coffee as they put it into the hopper. And then when the coffee comes out, they want to check if it's cooled off enough before they transfer it. And they stick their hand in the cooling bin just to feel the coffee and feel what it feels like. Now they've transferred yeast and mold, whatever else was on the coffee, into that finished product that they had just sanitized. It just had a kill step. So that's one way. And I am graphic like this because honestly, I know some amazing people who roast coffee, who do a beautiful product, but their product, actually, a couple of them had mold in it.
Oh, man.
It made me mad. And I'm like, so I tell people when I teach my classes, do not fondle the coffee. Don't go near it.
As tempting as it may be, do not fondle the coffee.
Or have a thing of hand sanitizer next to the roaster. Sanitize your hands if you feel like you have to touch your coffee. The other thing, scoops, if they use the same scoop, if their bin, somebody used the bin for green coffee and then they put the roast back in the same bin. I mean, these are the things
These are basic fail-safes that are being overlooked in lots of different industries. It's just human error is what you're saying, is one way to get this.
Well, it's not, it's human error, but it's actually against the law.
It's negligence more than error, I guess.
Safety, yeah.
Oops, you can do that once. You can't do it every time.
No, all roasters are supposed to meet the 2011 food safety law Obama put through called the Food Safety Modernization Act.
Oh, wow.
And one of the rules of it is good manufacturing practices.
Wow.
And you must follow them. And a lot of people. So this is something, but we do, and really the bigger companies must follow them, and they get inspected and stuff. It's the craft roasters who are wonderful and produce beautiful products. And as anybody knows from any craft food product, you go to France and some of these cheesemakers have the most magnificent cheeses and facilities. God. And you're like, oh my God, I'm eating
No one's washing his hands or petting the goat and then touching the cheese. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
The dog's running through the place.
I know exactly what you mean. But this is actually kind of enlightening because what you're saying is, a lot of the times it's these standards. The bigger companies are going to be held to those standards closely because of the extra monitoring or whatever. But as far as this idea that, hey, this mold in coffee thing is bullcrap, you can firmly say no, it's not, because you are part of these tests. You've seen this and you've actually seen the results yourself.
Yeah, I have the lab results.
Wow.
I have mold. I've seen mold in finished product. And the funny thing is the one product that had the most mold in it, and we're not talking huge amounts. Not talking fuzzy green coffee.
But still.
You wouldn't see this mold.
Right.
It was like 20 colonies of mold. They measure it in colonies, which is minimal. But still, and if you brew it hot, you're probably going to get the coffee. But
if you're trying to,
problem.
Yeah.
Now, we'll talk about cold brew at some other point, but we don't know what the consumer is going to do with our product. So we must make sure that it's food safe going into the package. The other way that, and this is a funny thing, Jordan, is when the coffee comes out of the roast, it is super hot.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the larger manufacturers have these continuous roasting systems where the roast beans just, start at one end and go through the other, like those toasters you see where they put the bread and it's on like
right, or like a bad pizza place, they just slide it through.
It's like a corkscrew
right,
thing,
okay.
right? So when it comes out, it's super hot, and they use a water spray to cool off the coffee.
Yeah,
quickly,
that sounds a little bit
You didn't know this.
dubious.
We call it water quench. It sounds dubious. So there's issues that happen here. First of all, a little bit of water quench at the end, super hot. The water's just going to touch the beans, evaporate. There's no water in the coffee, right? It's fine. It doesn't add any weight. It just evaporates instantly. It's just like when you throw water into a steaming hot pan on the stove and it goes, poosh. It's the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
However, these are large manufacturers. They get their water checked regularly to make sure there are no contaminants in the water or their water lines. That's one of their food safety checks. Because whenever you add water in a dry facility, you're going to, you're sort of messing yourself up. A dry facility has the advantage of having no water because the mold needs water to live.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. And
Without
to introduce
water,
that at such a late stage, it just sounds like you're asking for trouble.
Well, some of these guys, if they're not careful, and if water isn't good, or if their equipment goes out of whack, or somebody isn't paying attention, and now we could have a problem. Now, again, for the big manufacturers, they're very careful. These guys, I know people want to bash big companies, but in terms of food safety for coffee.
Well, it makes sense,
the
right?
People I know, the people I know who work for these big companies, they are just the top consummate professionals.
Well, they have to be
really
because that's who the regulators have their eyes on, because that's who, if they catch, they can get a big fat check and they can affect the most change in their eyes and all those, all those various reasons and interests.
Well,
of
also,
course.
They don't want to recall.
Exactly.
Because everything.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, we have to talk about that. We don't have time today, but I want to talk about what happens to these companies when they get recalls, because I know that they have to sometimes they have to issue refunds.
Let's do a food safety.
Yes.
I would love to do a whole food safety podcast and focus on coffee.
Absolutely. Let's continue this roasting series as well. Let's just have you back on all the time, Ildi. You are awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all this wisdom. We didn't get through the roasting questions again. Keep kicking butt out there. You just know so much about coffee, and I love having you on the show.
Take care. Bye, everybody.
All right, everyone. That's all for today. Thank you all for listening. Again, stay tuned for some food safety talk, some more roasting talk. Dr. Coffee is going to be back on shortly. Sanjeev will be back on. I know you guys love listening to our favorite regulars. Thank you all so much for listening and sharing the show. This is Ildi Revi and Jordan River signing off, wishing you an extraordinary day. We'll see you next time on the Coffee, Health, and Science Podcast. Bye-bye, everyone.